I feel like my brain is metaphorically lighting up because things are making so much sense. I'm just thinking, wow, yes, I can understand that. I see that. How amazing. And so I think it's a really great approach and very accessible, and writers should really be paying attention.
Hello, hello. I'm Melissa Bourbon, and this is the Writer Spark podcast where business, creativity, and the craft of writing converge. Welcome. 15 years ago, I was an avid reader, but not a writer. I didn't know anything about the actual craft, and I knew next to nothing about the publishing industry. But I had a dream to become a published author, and I set out to learn everything I could. Now, I'm a #1 Amazon and national best-selling author of more than 35 novels. I've published traditionally, and I've recently plunged into the world of indie publishing. And I teach people like you how to grow in their craft and find success in this ever-changing industry. I'm an ordinary person, a wife, a mom, a daughter, a teacher, living in a small North Carolina town. Through Writer Spark, I am doing what I love more than anything in the world, which is teaching and helping others on their writing journeys. I'm here as your partner as you navigate your own writing journey. I'm here to help you understand the essential elements of the writing craft, to build your confidence, and to help you find the success you desire. Welcome to the Writer Spark podcast. Seeing things from a new perspective can really give you a new way of seeing and internalizing things. That's how I felt after reading Bill Birchard's new book, Writing for Impact: 8 Secrets from Science to Fire Up Your Readers' Brains. This book really hit home for me on so many levels. There are a ton of craft books out there, but this one is different. It's science-based, and it gives a new vernacular and a new understanding of what most writers already do. Writing for Impact really got me thinking. I spent my early writing years gathering every craft book I could find, devouring principles and concepts, and trying to figure out how to incorporate it all into my writing. Needless to say, I became overwhelmed, probably like so many of you. Many people have many ideas. This is why the writing resource books that I write are very practical and geared towards the working writer. I've been overwhelmed by writing books and theories and advice between the pages, and it can be too much. Sometimes you just need it spelled out for you quick and dirty. That's what Bill does in Writing for Impact. The fundamental principle is to fulfill the desires hardwired into the human brain. There are 8 of them, and that's what Writing for Impact is all about, and it's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to my guest today, Bill Birchard, who is the author of many books, but the one that we're here to talk about today is Writing for Impact and the science behind engaging readers through through tapping into the brain, essentially. So welcome, Bill. I can't wait to jump in, but I'd love to hear a bit about your background first, sort of your origin story.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. For the past 25 years, I've been pretty much involved in writing books. I'm a nonfiction writer. I'm not a fiction writer. I write my own books, 6 of my own. Writing for Impact is the 6th. And I've written 10 for others in business, economics, health, etc. And before that, I was a freelance writer in the business press. Work appeared in Fast Company, Strategy and Business, Chief Financial Officer, etc. Those kinds of magazines. Before that, I was the editor of a company business magazine. So writing's pretty much been my life. And at this point, I wanted to share my latest passion, which is how science helps us engage readers when we know more about it and know more about what we've learned in the last couple decades from what happens in the brain.
So how did you come up with the idea to do this research and to connect engaging readers in fiction with brain science, with neurology?
Yeah, it evolved. I'm not a fiction writer, but I'm sure fiction evolves as well. And it was I'm at late stage career, so I wanted to pass on what I felt were key strategies in writing better. When people come to me and I coach them now in writing their own books, it's like, what do I tell them? And there were about 8 or 10 things that I thought were really important. And I started to look into, well, why are those important? And I originally had a biology degree, never used it, been a writer and editor my whole life. But when I started poking around in Google Scholar, I don't know how much fiction writers use Google Scholar, there was a treasure trove of experiments where scientists, psychologists, and neuroscientists primarily were looking at what happens in your brain when you read different kinds of things. A metaphor in a sentence versus a literal sentence, a simple sentence versus a complex sentence, a sentence that started a story versus one that did not. And they could see all kinds of things happening in the brain. Now, this is basic science. This isn't applied science. The scientists are not trying to figure out how to write better. That's not what they're trying to do. What they want to see is just how the brain works. What's lighting up in there, what interacts, etc.
So that really probably goes a lot to the trend towards storytelling and leadership.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, when clients come to me, one of the key things they want to do is integrate stories into their whatever message they're conveying about leadership, whether it's how to be run a more sustainable business, or whether it's how to have more empathy or whatever. How do you integrate a story into that? So yeah, that absolutely. And in fact,
Yeah.
that's my book is based or is structured on eight S's, the eight S's that engage readers. And the last one is story driven. And we'll get to that, I'm sure, as we go along.
Yeah, I love that. My husband is an educator and he teaches master's students in educational leadership. And, the thing that his students love most is the stories, the anecdotes that he's able to tell because
Hmm.
it's taking the concept, but then putting it into real life in an engaging way. So now that I've read this book, I just imagine their brains lighting up, as they're
That's
hearing these stories.
yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, of course, lighting up is a metaphor. The brain is wet. It's a bunch of chemical reactions. It's really wet where there's no fire up there at all. But that's the metaphor. Of course, there's
Yeah.
lighting up. Those chemical reactions are going on, and the principal ones that I'm interested in are the ones that are releasing dopamine and natural opioids in the brain that create pleasure.
That it's so fascinating. So, as I started to read the book, I came across the one of your catchphrases, which is the anatomy of comprehension, which I just loved. I mean, you're using
Hmm.
metaphors and similes and just these descriptors that are so engaging themselves as you write this book. So, I love that concept of the anatomy of comprehension and how the brain processes meaning and reward. Those are the two things that really
Exactly.
informed your eight S's. So
Right.
can we just
Exactly.
let's just dive right in. I think there's a lot to talk about. So let's just dive right into the
Yeah.
anatomy of comprehension, meaning and reward, and your eight S's.
Okay. Okay. Sure. Sure. First, I will make a distinction here. There's a huge amount of research out there on reading, and it's often related to things like dyslexia, etc. And that is where the brain is decoding the letters, and that all happens in the rear of the brain. That's where, believe it or not, even though your eyes in the front, the part that processes vision is in the back, and that is not research that is part of this. After the brain decodes the letters and decodes the words, a different part of the brain actually is decoding what it means. So my book is all about the meaning. And that happens on the left side of the brain, kind of a racing strip along the left side. It's not bilateral, it's not on both sides of the brain, which many things are. But the language processing, essentially, let's simplify it a little bit. It's looking up the definitions and understanding what those words are. That's happening on the left side of the brain. But that's only a beginning. That's only a beginning. And the simplest language is processed there. And you might say that if what you write is really boring, it's really plain words, then maybe that's the only part of the brain that is doing anything. But after that, if you have, say, specifics, if you use an action verb or you use a specific adjective or what have you, other parts of the brain light up, and including the motor circuits, which are across the top of the brain. The sensory circuits are as well, the auditory, the olfactory, etc. All of those light up. And then on top of that, if you have really compelling language, for example, with motor action, kicking, hitting, etc., then the muscles that would be engaged in real life, if you were actually performing that action, a very faint echo of a micro voltage goes through those muscles as well. So when you use specifics, for example, that's, and we all know that's important in writing, right? But now we know neurologically why, because it's lighting up the language circuits, it's lighting up the motor circuits and the sensory circuits, and it's actually lighting up tissue in the body. So you're getting this sort of full brain body buzz when you use specifics of that kind. So anyway, that's a sort of a quick introduction to the breadth of activity in the brain. We could go S by S, and I could tell you which parts of the brain actually are lighting up. Some of the parts you might have heard of, some you won't have heard of. I hadn't heard of them before I researched. If there's one you'd like me to start with, should I just start with the first? Keep it simple.
Yeah, yeah, I think we should just go through each of the S's. I do want to backtrack just a second, though. When you said that comprehension is all the left side of the brain, when you're, for example, looking up, trying to understand the definition of a word that you've never heard before, that's in some, field that you're not familiar with, is just sort of taking in that definition that maybe you don't even understand, always left brain, or is that part right brain? When you're looking at the definition, you're taking it in, but you don't understand it, and then you get context somehow to help you understand it, and that sort of clicks the left brain into
Right.
action? Or is it always all left brain?
Well, I'm simplifying a bit here. When you listen to anything or you read anything, a lot of the brain is activated. So it's just that's the primary what they call the classical language processing circuit. Actually, a lot of the brain is involved because even in words that don't have action involved in them, say concepts, say like a saga. Well, there's no action in that word itself, right? But you associate that with action because you've read about a saga before, or the saga of your neighbor's divorce or something. You associate it. So all of a sudden there are other parts of the brain that activate because it's associated with sight, sound, smells, action, etc. So I don't want to oversimplify too much, but I do that in the book somewhat just to just to highlight those parts of the brain that are particularly active. If you encounter a word you've never seen before, then you simply, you have to look it up, and then you have to associate it with those words that are in the definition, and that can include a lot of language in different parts of the brain. If it's emotional, it's the amygdala. If it's about surprising thing, it's a hippocampus. That's the seahorse shaped a component in the middle of your head. If it's related to something that's insightful, it's a flash on the right side of your brain. If it's let's see, it's let me take another one. Anticipation. It's a thing called the caudate nucleus. Anticipation, being in suspense, etc. That's like a little roof over the components in the middle of your brain. So they all those are highlighted, but they never operate alone. The brain is a very interconnected place, and I would say also that brain science is in the early years right now. It's where everybody's pioneering new research. And in fact, the research related to what my book is based on is new research, and we should probably get into that because the basis of the book I'm kind of glossing over here. Um,
Yeah, well, we can start with that. So, I have an old high school friend who actually went into neuropsychology, and that was 30 years ago now. So, when you say it's in its early stages of research, it's been around for a long
right.
time, but I think we're just making big strides, right?
Oh yes, huge strides. So if again we not oversimplify, we simplify a little bit. There's two kinds of research that go on. There's a behavioral research, which has happened for a long time. Give somebody something to read, give them a story, give them a metaphor, etc., and then see how they react. I mean, do
Mhm.
they say they're pleased? Do they react quickly or slowly? Do they remember it very well? That's behavioral research. And there's a lot of that. And there's a lot of that in my book, huge amount of that. Some of that dates back and some of it's relatively recent. You don't need a complex lab to do that. But you do need complex experimental procedures so that you rule out factors that might mislead you. So you have very simple sentences. You have three different sets of subjects, and one gets this text, and one gets that text, and one gets it is the control and gets yet other text. And so those can be complex experiments, but they're not technologically sophisticated. The ones that are very very much more sophisticated today are especially the ones using the modern scanning technologies. Functional MRI being the key one, which is an MRI. It takes an image that's kind of similar, like if you've hurt your knee or you've hurt your hip or shoulder, but it actually is measuring the exchange of oxygen in the brain, and we're talking about the brain in this case of the functional MRI. It's measuring the exchange in oxygen, and when oxygen is exchanged, there's a magnetism change in the brain, and that creates an image. So we know how quickly, basically, the brain is burning glucose, and which part of the brain is burning glucose the fastest is the part of the brain that's most activated. So that's a sort of a new toy in the for the neuroscientists, and they're learning a lot from that. But it's still limited. They take pictures, they ask people to read stuff, they see which parts of the brain light up, and then by inference they say, well, we know the hippocampus is involved in spatial learning and in surprise, and we know the amygdala is emotion, and look, it's lighting up when there's a metaphor. The amygdala is lighting up when there's a metaphor. That means there's inherently some emotion in that. And that's sort of the nature of a lot of the work today. And other work that's actually getting pretty advanced, and I'm going to say is going to be over my head, is probably good I'm writing this book now and not in 5 years, is the stuff with AI and data science, where you're crunching a lot of data to try to figure out how the brain operates. And then those are scientific articles that even with my, trying as hard as I cannot understand.
Yeah.
It takes a technician to
Yeah.
understand this.
Yeah, that's quite a lot. I just read something this morning that said there is evidence to show that in some situations, AI medical explanations can exhibit more empathy than an actual doctor, which is tapping into
Is that right?
emotional. Yeah, which, yeah, too much to even fathom right now.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let me explain what I think is the basis of the book, which is what's driving people to read and keep reading, and that's what motivates us to do anything. And it turns out it's this component or set of components in the brain called the reward circuit. When you want something to drink, you want something to eat, you want to befriend somebody, you want to look for shelter, you want to do anything that seems desirable. There's a part of the brain that is governing that. When a stimulus comes in, if it's a word, or it's the image of a donut, or it's the image of somebody that looks friendly, then your brain immediately evaluates that stimulus and said, is that worthy? Do I want it? Do I want to pursue it? Can I learn from it? And the reward circuit is doing that. There's a bunch of components there, some of which you've heard of, like the amygdala is one component. The others you have not, like a thing called the nucleus accumbens. And when that happens, dopamine is released. Now, historically, people thought dopamine created pleasure, but in fact, it doesn't create pleasure. We've learned that in more modern neuroscience. What it is it more sends signals through the reward circuit. What creates the pleasure, it disappears. Not this, the science is not absolutely final on this. What creates the pleasure is the dopamine stimulating release of natural opioids. There's a marijuana-like opioid, and there's a morphine-like opioid, and those are then released, and those create pleasure. So if you're getting tingles up the spine, or chills, or goosebumps, or what have you, you probably we can guess, right? This is not easy to confirm. We can guess that there were some opioids released in the brain. So my book, the whole book, is based on what are the things that drive the reward circuit when it comes to language. What can you do in language to drive the reward circuit? And so I started just exploring that. And I basically collected every article I could on scientists studying language, and scientists being relatively creative people when it comes to experiments. They'd studied a lot about a lot of different things. And I actually found out that some specialized in studying simple language, and some specialized in language that drove anticipation, and some specialized in stories. And our age of specialization, right? You would have thought Somebody specialized was just specialized in reading language, but no, there was some in all those areas. That then for me allowed me to distill 8 S's to write better, to better engage your readers.
Okay, so interesting. And I love that hearing about the research that you did that led you to this. And it just brings up, the sort of emotional charge we get when we get texts right now,
Right.
nowadays,
Uh-huh.
nowadays, so old fashioned with our cell phones and our instant connectivity with everybody on this sort of peripheral level, not necessarily face to face, but we're constantly seeking that probably stimulus in the brain that now we're conditioned to get.
Right.
and and I wonder how that is, affecting how language and our fiction triggers things in our brain, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
Let's dive into your 8 S's. So I'll just review them really quickly and then we'll go
Yeah.
through them. So we
Yeah,
have
sure.
the keep it simple, keep it specific, keep it surprising, keep it stirring. And that's kind of the first four. And then you move into the second half, which is keep it seductive, keep it smart, keep it social, and keep it story driven.
Right,
I love
right,
how you
right.
organized this. It's really it's so accessible, I think. And as a writer myself, I've written 32 books, and when I was first starting out, I was just wanting to get all of the information that I could, and some of it made sense, some of it didn't. So much of your learning is enhanced by your experience. And now, after having so much experience, when I read something like your book, as I have been doing, I feel like my brain is metaphorically lighting up because things are making so much sense. I'm just thinking, wow, yes, I can
Yeah,
understand that. I see
yeah.
that. How amazing. And so I think it's a really great approach and very accessible, and writers should really be paying attention to this.
I'm always learning. I'm curious and interested in honing my craft. And as a teacher, I know how important it is to have structure to my learning. I created the Ready Set Write course as a way to share a ton of what I have learned over the past 15 years with you. It's a comprehensive course that teaches you how to create your protagonist, antagonist, and your supporting characters. It has lessons on conflict, story structure, and the hero's journey, as well as what I call the essential elements of writing: setting, point of view, dialogue, mood and tone, and voice. Plus, there are lessons on scene, scene and sequel, and motivation reaction units. It took me a long time to truly internalize all of this, and my courses are a way to help you jump the line. They will guide you through the writing process so you can take the bull by the horns, so to speak, and write with real confidence. You can find out more about the WriterSpark courses and Ready Set Write at writersparkacademy.com/courses. I'll see you in the classroom.
There are 8 S's, all of which by inference. A lot of this by inference. Again, the part of the brain is lighting up. That's the reward circuit. When you follow any of these 8 strategies, if you keep it simple, you keep it seductive, you keep it surprising, etc. At the same time that happens, we're able to see in scanners that the reward circuit or the components of are lighting up, and so we can infer from that that there's probably pleasure involved. And in fact, the reward circuit kind of gets involved in every stimulus coming in the door of the consciousness, and our brain has marvelous ways of filtering out huge amounts of trash, but it does pay attention to some things, and when it pays attention, it's often related to one of these S's, right? So keep it simple. Why is simple important? Well, it turns out simple sentences, simple words, easy processing is something that engages the reward circuit. I mean, it's if you write a complex sentence, you make it hard to understand, people just simply don't get a reward of dopamine and natural opioids. And why is that? I mean, scientists assume that it's because as we evolved to favor people who were giving us information that was easy to process. And scientists have a word for that called processing fluency. So not only is it easier in terms of effort, we're actually getting a reward that's evolutionarily driven for keeping it simple. So there's no long sentences that are hard to decipher are not in your interest because they're not going to engage the reader. The readers get a. That's not to say we write like ad copywriters, where every other word is a sentence itself, but shorter and processing fluently processed sentences are rewarded. You're going to reward your readers. Specifics, we already talked a little bit about specifics. They're highly rewarding because they activate so much of the brain that creates a huge amount of fodder for the reward circuit to look at and to evaluate and to like. And so, I mean, that's pretty much the importance of specifics. If you write really active sentences, it's just readers going to feel enriched. I think we all feel that. I should say that the research that I did in some ways defined what the muse is. What's our intuitive muse telling us when we sit down? Why have we always been taught to write by ear? Does it sound right? Why is that? Because we are all equipped with this reward circuit that evolved over millions of years that is giving us an intuitive sense for what the scientists are now showing us. So you when you use these strategies, you're using them in tandem with your intuition. So your muse and the information you have from scientists work together kind of as a way to double your skill set. They're not in conflict. They just reinforce each other. So I want to make that point that we're not discovering something that's going to overturn the what the masters have always said about writing. So let me move to the third one is keep it surprising. I mean, why is surprise important? I mean, obviously we involved if there's a snake or there's something we need to worry about, it's a surprise, and we are hardwired to react to surprise extremely fast, and that's just because we survived and thrived that way. That's pretty easy to understand. So we get a reward for that. And then stirring, similarly, if there was emotion involved in language, aside from body language and aside from tone of voice, if a word implied something that had emotion in it, like danger or fear or happiness, we process that very quickly. And it turns out that this is extremely interesting. The emotional component of a word, say I say fear, or I say avalanche, or I say fire, it almost seems counterintuitive, but your brain processes the emotional component of that word in about 200 milliseconds, about 2/10 of a second, and it processes the full meaning of that, what the scientists call semantic meaning, in 400 milliseconds. And so you are actually getting the emotional hit before you get the logical hit, so to speak. And your brain is combining those two to come up with the full meaning of what you're reading or what you're listening to. So emotion is a very powerful driver of the reward circuit, and a very powerful drive of engaging readers. And then moving on to keep it seductive. That's not what you think right off, right? Seductive we think of as a sexual link, but it's more in the broader sense, the alluring sense, the tempting sense. And in specific, this is an area where scientists study the rewards from anticipation. Why will you wait today to eat that piece of chocolate cake so you can have it tomorrow? Because there's a reward. There's actually a dopamine opioid reward for waiting for something you're anticipating to be really good. And so this says everything about fiction, right? I'm not a fiction writer, but why is suspense important? That's one reason. And why is foreshadowing and maybe even flash forwarding important? It's because in the interim, you are actually giving the reader a reward. You're engaging the reader after you hinted at something that's going to happen. They're wondering what's up. Now they're not just wondering, they are actually enjoying the wonder. So I found that fascinating. And that's, of course, true in nonfiction. Of course, nonfiction writers don't worry quite as much about suspense, but it certainly plays to engaging your reader if you're writing about financial topics. And then the next one is I say keep it smart, and for that it's what I'm implying is not just keep it intelligent, but keep it insightful. Keep it so that you're having leaps of insight about the human nature, about the way the world works, etc. That it turns out that when someone experiences an aha, and scientists actually have a technical term for this, it's called the aha moment. That's actually what they call it. They research the aha moment. A whole part of your brain on the right side lights up, and at the same time, there's a huge surge in the reward circuit. So when you're able to say, can I make this just a little bit more illuminating? Then you are driving engagement in readers. So it's worth that extra effort, not to say something straightforward, but to say it in maybe a little more insightful way, a way that pulls your readers in and maybe surfacing a universal truth or something like that. And then the next one is keep it social. And this is another one that's, of course, important to fiction writers. When you're reading, of course, you're not having direct social contact with anybody. So in fiction, you're doing it through your characters, right? And what is the part that most lights up in people's brains when they are reading about other people? It's the part of the brain that is trying to figure out what's happening in the other person's brain. The scientists call this mentalizing, or easier to understand is mind reading. You are trying to figure out what's happening in those characters' brains. And that is highly rewarding. Of course, we're all wired for that. Evolutionarily, we needed to know what was happening in other people's brains, whether friends or foes or what have you. And that's still, of course, true today. We're always, always looking ahead. Our brain is always active, trying to figure out what other people are thinking. You're trying to figure out what I'm thinking right now. I'm trying to figure out what you're thinking. You're trying to figure out what I'm thinking of you. I mean, that's just the way we are. We're wired that way. And so that's a very when you expose that for readers in your stories, that's a very powerful driver reward. And then the last one is keep it story driven, and that's what fiction's about. What I would like to just comment on that is I have nothing to say. I'm sure that you haven't already covered another podcast about story in my book, but what's interesting is the science that supports the power of story. And that's what's really interesting. It just reinforces just how important that is to being human and to transmitting information as a human being. And I'll just cite one aspect of the research there. And this is not fully understood, but clearly the brain is wired in a way that is very powerful with story. When you tell me a story, the activation in your pattern in your brain, and they scan this with an fMRI, a functional MRI machine, that is duplicated in my brain. And if I then go tell someone else the story you told me, the activity in their brain is duplicated, is a duplicate of mine, and then a duplicate of yours. And scientists don't fully understand why this is true. And there's other experiments that I could go into, but they don't understand why this is true. But clearly, stories have a riveting potential on human beings. So those are the eight. And just a final comment on that is that a story is sort of a symphony of all of the other S's, or all the other strategies for writing to engage readers. Sometimes when you're, especially, I think of often this in editing, you want to kind of raise your game a little bit. Sometimes it's improving your story, but sometimes it can just be improving the surprise in your sentence, or the word you chose to evoke emotion, or it could be the level of insight that you created, etc. So sometimes you could just work on one of those S's and not try to work on the eighth one, which is the symphony. Play one instrument at a time sometimes, and that's going to help you move your sentence along that you're struggling with.
Okay, so I have a few questions. So first of all, what I heard you saying was that the person telling the story, whether that's an oral story, a written story, is getting the same sort of brain activation that the person receiving the story is getting. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And scientists don't fully understand the ramifications of that, but that obviously shows that we are wired to connect with people when they tell stories. Other research shows, for example, and if you're writing, your whole book is fiction, this is significant, that the longer the story goes on, the more engaged you get. If it's in experiments, they will start a story that's 3 sentences long. We were riding in the plane, it crashed, but we barely survived. Whatever, a story that's 3 sentences long, and then they'll have some that are 150 words long, and then they'll have some that are 7 or 8 minutes long, and they find that the engagement increases the longer the story is. So that plays to fiction. Obviously, long form fiction plays to engaging people just by its nature.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and it, I think, goes a long way to explain why writers write, because we are getting that same brain charge, or satisfaction,
Exactly.
reward, right? If we have the meaning and reward, we're getting that reward through the process of writing and telling our stories. So that's
Right,
interesting.
right. And you touch on something that's very important there. Again, is what's happening when you engage readers needs to first happen in your brain. So
Mhm.
if you're trying to keep it simple, if you're not feeling engaged by having simplified a passage, then your reader probably isn't either. And if you're not feeling stirred up by having added the right emotions, because I often focus on the right emotions, it's not any emotion, but the right emotions, the appropriate ones, um, then your reader isn't either. So you're the first filter,
Yeah.
and you shouldn't feel that necessarily as a tingle, although you might, but you should feel it. So the muse and the science there again they work together.
Yeah, I can think of instances where I have made myself laugh out loud or made myself cry or,
Right,
whatever
right,
the emotion is, I actively think, "Oh, that's really good because I felt the emotion of the words that I just wrote." So
right, right, right.
yeah, that's
Right. There's a great Robert Frost quote. Our poet from New England, where I am, is no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader, no
yeah,
surprise in
yeah,
the writer, no surprise in the reader. And I
yeah.
mean, it's almost, it's like I say, this the science and what we've been told by the masters of writing over the centuries. They dovetail, they complement each other. They knowing both. I think one of the things I think is it just simply gives you more confidence. If you've got a complex set of sentences that you think have a problem, all of a sudden you go, well, maybe part of the problem is they're just complex. I mean, the science shows that, so now you have confidence. But if you didn't have that science, you might have thought, well, I still kind of like those long sentences. But then you have to say, well, if the processing fluency is hampered, that means that you're going to engage the reader less. It's simple as that.
I think it goes to genre too, and the type of fiction that's being written. Literary fiction, probably
Mm-hmm.
just inherently
Mm-hmm.
has more complex sentences compared to, say, a straight genre written book. Keeping it simple, I think, also probably taps into our collective reading level, which is
Mm-hmm.
not that sophisticated as a
Yeah.
whole
Right.
society,
Right.
so
Right.
I
Right.
think that if you have more complex sentences, you're going to pull the reader out because they have to stop and think about it. And your whole point
Right.
with engagement as a writer is to not pull the reader out of the narrative, but to keep them
Right.
fully immersed in it.
Right.
And
Right.
so
Right.
keeping those
Sure.
sentences simpler allows them to just keep going, keep going, keep going without having to stop and say, wait, what did let me go back to the sentence and those clauses and dependent clauses, independent clauses, and wait, I've got confused.
Right.
That sort of
Yeah, and
thing.
it goes without saying. I think it goes without saying that simpler sentences don't mean simplistic writing. They just mean more fluently processed. I
Mhm.
think often, when I write, because I often my first drafts often have very long sentences. Okay, I'm writing on fiction, but they often are very long sentences, and I go, "How did I ever write a sentence that long?" And the point is that you had this kind of long thought. And what you have to realize is that thought actually could be broken into two or three parts, and that's where the period comes. And that's why I don't know if it's said in fiction, but in nonfiction, journalists and so forth often say the period never comes soon enough. The period needs to come when the thought is complete. And if the thought is too long, then you need to figure out how to bring closure to it more frequently. So you're instead of giving readers a steak to cut into, you give them sirloin tips to pop in their mouth. I mean,
Mhm.
it still should be just as nourishing. Should still be,
Brownie
yeah.
bites.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Okay, so simple, simplistic goes to sort of reading level, our ability to absorb, completion of thoughts, and then what I've done is kind of looked at your eight S's and connected them to what what is sort of commonly understood in the fiction world in the elements
Right,
of writing. So specific is really showing versus telling, right? We want to get into those sensory details and create pictures and using imagery rather than telling what's happening.
right, right, right. If you bear with me, I'd like to read something I have here,
Mhm.
um, and uh, there are two passages in which the writers are describing what life is. Okay, the first one is by Chief Crowfoot of the Blackfoot Nation. This is in my book. This is a quote probably a lot of people have heard, but he says, "What is life? It is the flash of a firefly in the night It is the breath of a buffalo in the wintertime. It is the little shadow which runs across the grass and loses itself in the sunset. So we're defining life with specifics there. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Now, here's another one I ran across. Here's Oscar Wilde writing about life. Life is not governed by will or intention, a chance tone of color in a room or a morning sky, a particular perfume that you had once loved and that brings subtle memories with it, a line from a forgotten poem that you had come across again, a cadence from a piece of music that you had ceased to play. I tell you, that it is on things like these that our lives depend. So there's the specifics. I was even thinking, if you wanted a writing prompt, put in sentences and what life is, using no abstractions, just using specifics to define it like that. I mean, those are wonderful quotes, and those, particularly the Chief Crowfoot one, you see that around a lot. I don't know if you've seen it before, but you see it around a lot, and that's why. I mean, it's just simple as that. The specifics drive a huge amount of activity in the brain, which in turn drives a huge reward for the reader.
Very poetic. Yeah. Those are beautiful. And you don't think about it in those terms necessarily. So it's important to hear examples and read examples
Exactly.
like these so that we can begin to internalize how to do that ourselves. All right. So the surprising S is really about conflict, creating conflict. And um, when you write a scene, you have goal, motivation,
Hmm.
conflict, and
Hmm.
disaster, and you're leaving your scene
Hmm.
on some sort of new story question, new scene
Uh-huh.
question. So you're
Uh-huh.
continually surprising the reader with what's going to come
Uh-huh.
next. So that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And surprise again, when you're editing, surprise can also be just a turn of phrase that's surprising. The reader enjoys that too. I mentioned that a lot in my book. Some examples there. One I like is John Steinbeck wrote at one point in his book. He was describing Monterey, and he said it was. So this is Travels with Charlie in Search of America, one of his nonfiction pieces. That the town was undirtied by undiapered minds. Now, how can you beat that for surprise, right? Or there's a novel about Guadeloupe. I went to Guadeloupe, read a novel by a local novelist there, and she was describing this is in the book by Simone Schwartzbart. I want to give her credit. She wrote in her book about one of the characters. She was a vanilla pod that had burst in the sun and at last gives forth all its perfume. I mean, how can you beat stuff like that? Just little surprises, right? It's not even your plot, but just little
Right.
surprises. Readers like that too.
Right. And I think that really almost taps into the emotion too. And that's what you're saying. Everything works
Sure.
in tandem. But yeah,
Hmm.
and going back to these S's as they apply to the writer as well as the reader, I'm a hybrid plotter pantser, definitely. And,
Uh-huh.
as I do research on whatever it is I'm working on in that particular moment, I have so many surprising moments, aha moments that
Uh-huh.
inform where I'm going to go with the book or some detail that I'm going to add. And I feel that tingle that you were describing. I
Hmm.
feel
Hmm.
that very viscerally that this brilliant thing has just happened and it surprised
Hmm.
me, which means
Hmm.
it's going to be able to surprise my reader.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's working on both sides of the fiction book from the writer to the reader.
Right. Right. Exactly. No, you captured it perfectly there. Yeah.
Okay, so stirring, we talked about emotions already and just, having that sort of visceral experience or just tapping into the human experience and the emotions that we all that are universal to us. So that's one thing that is something that writers are always trying to tackle. And then
Right.
anticipation, seductive is your next S, and that really builds to
Right.
anticipation, which I love. That's the word that came to mind when you were describing it, and then you said anticipation, and I think that's exactly right. And that's what we all are trying to do, is to keep the reader wanting to know what's next with those
Right.
story questions, with
Right.
those scene questions and things like that. So,
Yeah, in that case, from my point of view as a nonfiction writer, it's all about the setup. There's sort of the promise, and then there's the payoff. So
Mhm.
there's got to be a set of promises going on all the time. In nonfiction, it can be a simple topic sentences. I like to tell people that I feel like, you know, eighth grade English teachers are vindicated by the research, because it shows that topic sentences not only help you integrate the material that comes after it. Now, I'm not recommending topic sentences necessarily for fiction, but they make a promise to the reader that there's going to be a payoff, and so it creates a little bit of anticipation. Now, obviously, in a lot of high school homework, there's not a lot of pleasure in the anticipation, but it does still work even at that level.
Yeah. Well, in terms of fiction, that's what romance and mysteries are all about. You know, you have the anticipation of this hero and heroine getting together in the end and this push and pull all the way through. And with the mysteries, you have the red herrings and the misdirections and the little bits of clue and the reader trying to stay
Yeah,
ahead of the sleuth. And same with suspense, you know, because the reader is more informed than the characters in the book usually, because we have the villain's point of view
yeah,
being
right,
told to
right,
us.
right,
So
right,
all of the anticipation can come in many different forms.
right.
But, you know, and
Yeah.
I this is absolutely dating myself, but you know, the whole love story between Sam and Diane in Cheers, for example, or
Yeah.
Maddie and David in Moonlighting, or, you
Uh-huh.
know, more contemporary, maybe Friends. But it's that anticipation of when are they going to kiss? When is this going to happen? But then as soon as it does, we don't care anymore. It's like, okay, it's over
That's
because
right.
we were really in
That's
it for
right.
the anticipation.
Right, 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 right. There's a quote by Alfred Hitchcock. I don't think I can get it quite right, but he basically says there's basically no reward in the terror. The reward is in the run up to the terror. I mean,
Mm,
he said something more eloquent than that. But even in a horror story, I mean, I don't know if any of your listeners write horror, but even there, it's all the anticipation.
right, right. Yeah,
Yeah, the just for a bit of mind candy here, there's a great experiment that's in my book, but it's a great experiment that's done by a guy named George Lowenstein. It's a seminal experiment where he asked students a bunch of questions about how much they would value things, and one of them was a kiss from a celebrity of their choice. And then after that, learning how much they pay for that, he asked, "How much more would you pay if you delayed it for a day, for 3 days, or even for a year?" And it turned out the students would pay the most delaying it for 1 or 3 days, something like that, and even would still pay more for delaying it for a year. So the this is a scientist, right, saying the anticipatory utility went up with that shorter uh, delayed period. So you're actually getting the sum of two things. You're getting the pleasure of the payoff, and you're getting the pleasure of the anticipation added together. And human beings make that calculation intuitively, that I'm going to
mm,
get the most pleasure. It goes back to the chocolate cake again, right? I'm going to get the most pleasure, not if I eat this chocolate cake right now, but if I put it aside and I think about it, enjoy the thought of eating it tomorrow.
mhm.
And
That's
we're
so
hardwired that way. We're
yeah,
hardwired that way. We get a reward. We get a reward. I mean, the dopamine is going. I mean, actually getting a neural reward for that period of anticipation.
which in fiction writing, I think it's really important to understand that and to make sure that your subplots are working in a similar fashion, because once your main plot post climax is resolved, you still want the readers to finish the book. And that means wrapping up your subplots as well and
Uh huh.
offering that
Uh huh. Uh huh.
resolution or the, you know, return with the elixir if it's the hero's journey or whatever. And that has to be a payoff from that anticipation as well. So it's not just one line of anticipation, it's multiple based on all of your subplots. Otherwise, as soon as the hero and the heroine kiss, that's it, the story's over, close the book, even though you might have a whole nother chapter
Right. Right.
left
Right. Right.
and nobody
Right. And
cares
you're
because
relying.
you didn't build it
You,
up.
yeah, and you're relying on your setups earlier in the book to carry the reader along, because they're anticipating. They're
Hmm.
anticipating. They're enjoying the anticipation of your tying that all together at the end.
Right. And in mysteries, you know, have talked on this podcast in the past about how mysteries, specifically cozy mysteries,
differ a lot now from how they were originally written. And you look at Agatha Christie books, for example, mystery is solved, that's it, it's over. And here now we write very character driven mysteries with sleuths that carry a series. And so we've got these subplots that are connected to their lives and the society, the community of people that we've created. And you have to have this series arc that's connected to those
Mhm.
people and to your
Mhm.
sleuth or your heroine or your hero, whatever. And
Mhm.
that's what it's all about. It's about that anticipation of this entire story arc that you've created.
Mhm. 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 Yeah, yeah, that's great. Yeah,
Uh,
those are certain techniques you use way more in fiction than in nonfiction, but you can see how there's still basic fundamental drivers of what makes us human, right? What we get rewarded for.
yeah, exactly. And then keeping it smart, which I have one particular series that has a lot of Irish history in it. And
Uh-huh.
I have another series that has sort of an alternate history with Butch Cassidy. And so I pull in those historical elements and I get reader feedback quite often about that they learned something. They love to read
Yeah,
something
yeah.
that's, light fiction, genre fiction, whatever, but they get to learn something along the way. So I think it also adds depth when you layer in something greater than the story that the reader can take away, whether that's
Absolutely.
insight, as you
Absolutely.
mentioned, or whether it's actual knowledge of something concrete, historical. But building in something deeper that the reader can take away, I think, engages them more, just
Yeah.
invests them
Yeah.
more.
Yeah, absolutely. That's true. That statement, you could make that statement, and put those words in my mouth to nonfiction
Mm,
authors that I work with. When you're writing serious stuff, well, you might be writing about leadership. That's the easiest one to choose. And your leadership is about leading a corporation. But I say to them, okay, so that's great, but you need to also surface more perennial truths about that, things that resonate more deeply with us as human beings. So okay, so this point you're going to make is about leadership in the corporation. Well, what about leadership in the community or in the family or in the nation? Will it resonate on all those levels? If it doesn't resonate on all those levels, then I say then maybe you need to rethink it, because the reader, we are all like this, thinks in analogies, and they're always not only thinking about what's in front of them,
mhm,
whether it's the story of a technical topic or it's a story in fiction. They're thinking about those analogies in their own lives, and make sure that when you write, those analogies are apparent. You don't have to spell it out for the reader, but
mhm.
just write it in a way that they surface those more universal truths, and that's where the readers get their own ahas, and that's the most rewarding aha, when you come to one on your own, not one you're led to.
And that's what happened with me as I was reading your book and I was making these connections to what I already know about writing fiction and thinking, "Oh yes, that's what this means. I already knew that,
Yeah,
but this is a new way to look at it," which I think when you have multiple ways to look at something, it can help solidify it or it can help you really
absolutely.
internalize it on a deeper level. And that's what I took away from this book on a lot of instances. So I think that was exciting for me, and especially after 32 books when I feel like I'm always going to be learning. But when I get something that's really an aha for me, that's really making a strong connection about my craft, that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, yeah, that's why I say it kind of doubles your skill set. Listen to your muse, but listen to the neuroscientists too. They're
Mhm.
saying the same thing, and you get it from two different, very different angles, and that reinforces it. It gives you more confidence as a writer, and of course, confidence is all important.
And it's something that writers can take away and or refer back to when we get that writer's block. I don't really necessarily believe in writer's block because I believe in moving forward to something else, not
Hmm.
not getting stuck and staying there. But, when you do get stuck in something, then you can refer to these 8 S's and think
Yeah,
about, okay, what can I do to this
yeah,
scene that's going to pull in one of these things
yeah,
that I know is going to engage my
yeah,
readers. So
yeah,
it's really a
yeah.
concrete tool to
Yeah,
use
it is.
as you're
Like
writing.
I say, how can I raise the insight level in this paragraph? How can I create some anticipation? Should I had a little setup here to get
Right.
people wondering what's coming next? It could be just later in that passage of dialogue. It doesn't have to be later in the book. I mean, you can do it from at the micro level and at the macro level.
Oh, that's such a great point. Yeah, we want to look at it in sentences, in paragraphs, in scenes, in the scene and sequel scenes, the two parts of a scene,
Yeah,
and
there you
then
go.
as a story whole. So we can look at these eight S's in many different ways and apply them to our writing in many different levels. I love that.
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so social, we have social, which is, uh, I think the reason that we read in so many instances, it's because we want to connect, we want to understand, we want to experience things that are outside of our normal world, perhaps,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
also on that more subliminal level, we are understanding people, we're understanding society, we're understanding humanity, we're understanding different things
Right.
that are social within our world, but maybe not entirely accessible or that we don't understand on the level that we want to,
Mhm. Mhm.
which is why
Yeah.
we read.
Yeah, and nonfiction, as you say, and I think you could, if I was writing this book for only for fiction authors, I was a fiction author like you are, I would probably have a different chapter. But in nonfiction, I mean, the key thing is again getting people to wonder about what other people are wondering, the complexity of their internal dialogue, their internal speculation about what's going on with other people.
Mhm.
That's fascinating, right? We're hardwired to do that. I mean, we're extremely active with that, and we get a huge amount of reward from doing that, whether we're doing it face to face or whether we're doing it while we're reading a book and wondering what's going on between the two characters that are there on the page.
It's so great to think about it in a new way like that, and what we are trying to do as writers and what we're trying to get readers to take away. And that probably a lot of us do it subliminally or, unconscious, subconsciously
Sure,
anyway, but
sure,
to think about it more actively, I think gives us a lot of tools that we can use.
exactly. Yeah.
And then
Well
the
put.
final S was story driven, which we've talked about, a little bit, but that engagement, I think it goes back to understanding the elements of a story, whether you, the writer, use the three-act structure or the hero's journey or a four-act structure, whatever
Hmm.
your snowflake method, whatever your method of telling a story is, you need to have a solid story that you are
Hmm.
telling
Hmm.
in order to
Hmm.
ultimately engage the reader. Because if you are
Right.
lacking any of those key plot twists building up to the climax, your story is going to fall flat.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's correct. You know way more about fiction than I do. But there's research also that shows the rise and fall of activity in the brain in different parts with the rising fall of the action in stories. So getting that right is something people very actively follow. We're just
Mhm.
we're just wired to follow a story. Scientists also think that the story was a convenient way of conveying lessons. That's sort of the most standard view that it's so effective with cause and effect and so forth to learn lessons from, that we were hardwired to, that was actually favored there's actually some research that shows in hunter-gatherer tribes. There's one big research study done in the Philippines of a hunter-gatherer tribe, a current one, that the best storytellers in the tribe and in the different villages of the tribe were always the most revered. And it turned out that they also had slightly larger families.
Hmm.
So if you're into evolution, what it means is that storytelling ability is being selected for. If the storytellers are already having larger families and they're passing on their genes that are good at storytelling, then what it means is that every generation gets better at telling stories. So the faculty for telling and deciphering stories, this is just one research study, could actually be evolutionarily driven.
That's what fables are all about, is teaching
Yeah.
those lessons, learning from them, and even mythology, telling
Right.
stories to explain the
Right.
unexplainable, right?
Right, right, right. So yeah, so you're in a hardwired, you're in what we can say neuroscience is saying is a hardwired profession now. You're dealing with the hardwiring of the brain.
Well, Bill, I want to thank you so much for being here. These eight S's, this book, it's fascinating. And again, for me, it
triggered all kinds of connections to what I already
Right.
know. So I highly recommend this. Everybody who's listening, anybody who's watching, I really highly recommend getting Writing for Impact, because you, the writer, are going to have all kinds of moments where your brain is lighting up with these connections that this book will make for you. And I really strongly believe it's going to enhance your fiction writing. So I think it's a great book, and I really appreciate you taking the time to
Yeah.
talk about it with me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's nice to hear that's the way you feel, because as they say, these 8 S's, I think of them as hardwired primal desires. I mean, people want surprise, people want it stirring, people want it story driven. And so if you give it to them, and they're going to get a reward for it. So there's the motto of my book: reward your reader. I like to say that people don't read what you write because they like your style. They read what you write because they like how you reward them.
Right. It's how you feel, right? People say you don't might not necessarily remember a teacher, but you're going to remember how they made you feel.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what it's about.
Reward yourself. And when you reward yourself, you reward your reader.
Right.
Just as you were saying earlier.
Thank you again, Bill, for being here. This has been so fascinating. And again, I encourage everybody to go out and buy this book, Writing for Impact.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you so much for listening and spending your time with me today, everyone. I'm Melissa Bourbon, and this is the Writer's Spark podcast. Take a moment to visit our website at www.writersparkacademy.com. Check out our courses, our resources, and all the content there. And I will see you next time. Until then, happy writing.